today. So first we're going to go into a bit of background on anonymization, so why it's important, what are some of the theoretical underpinnings, what are some of your legal responsibilities, and then we'll go into a short exercise using Mentimeter, and then we'll have a little bit more of a practical overview, which includes examples of collections we've worked with, how they were anonymized, and what kind of tips that we have for you for doing that. We'll end with just a couple of exercises all together on de-identifying information. And then if you have any questions then that have come through during the session, we'll answer those at the very, very end. So now I'm going to hand over to Anka to talk about why we need to even anonymize. Why is this a point of discussion? Anka?
Thank you, Maureen. Yes, so first of all, we wanted to look at what is this, disclosure and why do we need to even consider anonymizing data, right? So what we mean by disclosure is identification. So disclosure happens when someone is able to identify a data subject from data or information that they have access from that can be one source or multiple sources. There are different types of disclosure and I listed them here. So we have identity, attribute, and inferential disclosure. And because this was is a very quite a lengthy topic to go into, I just listed them, and you can have a look at the different types if you wish. But what is for today's presentation and what we're going to do is best if you just think of it as primary and secondary disclosure. And what that means, primary disclosure is where you can clearly identify someone from one data source. And secondary disclosure is when you have, you can't necessarily identify someone from one particular source, but when you put the information together and you perhaps also have other sources of information, so another source of data, then you can then infer who that person is. Right, so if we think of just primary and secondary disclosure for today, we'll mention it throughout the presentation, and then I listed the three types there as well if you want to have a more in detailed look. So then when we talk about anonymization, so this is a process that attempts to prevent disclosure, right? So we're trying to prevent the identification of data subjects from a specific data set. And anonymization and pseudonymization, and we'll also talk about the difference between them and the roles they play in sharing data. They're both part of statistical disclosure control or SDC. You've probably heard of this before. So the aim of SDC is to minimize or mitigate the risk of identifying individuals, and we're trying to mitigate or minimize this risk to an acceptable level that will still allow researchers to maximize data use, right? So use the data to its full potential or as close as possible. And finally here, I wanted to introduce also the term of information loss in relation to disclosure risk, right? Because when we're trying to minimize or mitigate this risk by anonymizing or pseudonymizing data, we need to keep in mind that there's potentially an information loss there. When we're starting to strip data from these identifying information, then arguably we're also having some information loss there. So we're trying to find the balance between keeping as much utility in the data as possible for future reuse, while also trying to minimize and mitigate that risk of identification. Okay. And I think this is for this slide, Maureen, if we're ready to move on.
Yeah. So I just wanted to go, following on from that, I just wanted to go a little bit more into sort of the theory behind anonymization and how you make certain decisions about what to anonymize or what not to anonymize, or how you assess risk. Mark Elliott from the UK Anonymisation Network has published the Anonymisation Decision-Making Framework, the ADF. And the National Center for Research Methods has extensive tutorials from him where he goes into a little bit more detail about this framework. But basically, this framework outlines three key aspects to making decisions on what to anonymize. And the first of these is thinking about the data situation, auditing what the data situation is. And that's specifically considering, where you want to present your data, what your role and responsibility is with that data, and what are the specifics of the data. So in other words, what variables have you collected and how are they stored? The next stage after doing that is to actually do a risk analysis. So what is the actual probability, the chances of there being a disclosure? And then the final stage to this is thinking about impact management. So if there is a disclosure, what are the plans for what happens then? And there's just a couple of key points that I want to pull away from this framework that he's put forward here. One is that analyzing the risk of disclosure should be something that's iterative. So it's not linear. There's no single point that you would assess, but rather it's something that you should be thinking about in all of the places that your data are stored or all of the places you're planning on presenting that data. So there's not a specific point as such when we think about disclosure, but rather it's the whole process. And when you think about, for example, the risk of publishing data extracts, that should be considered alongside sharing data with colleagues across institutions if you're working in teams, or even just storing data on your computer. The other point that I want to stress is that Mark Elliott says that it's not possible to fully anonymize data, at least not theoretically. So when people use terms like fully anonymizing or they might be guaranteeing that information will be kept confidential, this is kind of this theoretical abstract point that we're saying that you would not be able in any sense to de-identify that information. So that means that even if a participant was looking at your data set, they wouldn't be able to even identify themselves in that data set. And it's at that point where you might need to ask, is stripping down the data that much to that point actually of any value then? How can you analyze data if you have no way of providing even just the smallest bit of context there? So to avoid depleting the value of your data, even a good comprehensive anonymization strategy would still leave some, albeit a quite theoretical, space for re-identifying. So the idea with anonymization is to balance your risk of disclosure. So what's the possibility of re-identifying someone to the point where any risk then can be mitigated and dealt with. So the idea of fully anonymizing something or guaranteeing confidentiality isn't something that is theoretically anyways possible or perhaps even desirable because it does suggest stripping down that data to something that is perhaps not as worthwhile for analysis. And on that point, I also just want to mention that researchers still fall under some legal obligations to disclose. So specifically within the UK, researchers do have a duty of confidentiality. However, the duty of confidentiality is not absolute and it's not protected by legal privilege. So specifically, researchers are still obliged to inform appropriate authorities where there's abuse of children or vulnerable adults, or there are crimes that are covered under terrorism prevention legislation. So even something like money laundering is considered, is covered under the Terrorism Act 2000. So my own experience with this is from my own PhD research. And I went through the Health Research Authority for my ethical approval on my project. And my project was basically just looking at pregnancy narratives. And I was looking to try and recruit participants by putting up a poster in a GP office, which meant I had to get ethical approval from the Health Research Authority. And when I went through that process, they specifically scrutinized my consent forms for clear statements which clarified the limits of confidentiality. And this included thinking about possibilities where some of the raw data might be presented, such as publications or conferences, but also informing participants that I could actually break confidentiality if they disclose something about child abuse or other illegal activity. So this is just a snippet from my participant information sheet, which does sort of say that, you know, some unanonymized data might be audited by the Health Research Authority, the NHS staff, trust staff may also be able to look at it. But also, if you disclose illegal or criminal activity to me, I may need to discuss the issue further with appropriate authorities. So you can see the sample text there. Obviously, there's different ways of approaching this, but it's just, I think, to point out that anonymization is a bit of an art form. It's not an absolute. And so at the end of this presentation, I hope that's one of the points that you kind of take away from this, that there are sort of limitations to what we can guarantee participants, and what underpins, I think, a good anonymization strategy is ensuring that participants are informed and that there's appropriate consent in place for anything that you want to discuss with them and anything you want to do with that data going forward. And I think, Anka, you'll move on here to talk about the difference between anonymization and pseudonymization. I can't even say it.
Me neither. Sometimes that word is just pseudonymization. Yeah, thank you, Maureen. So we're looking here at the difference between them, these two terms, and I copied their the official definition under GDPR, so the General Data Protection Regulation. So what is anonymized data? So information which does not relate to an unidentified or identifiable natural person, or to personal data rendered anonymous in such a manner that the data subject is not or is no longer identifiable. Right, so it cannot re-identify data subjects, and this is even to the data owner. So the data has been stripped of all the information. Even the data owner that collected the data, if they were to look at it, they wouldn't be able to tell, yes, that is X, that is Y, etc. And then we have pseudonymized data, and this is the processing of personal data in such a manner that the personal data can no longer be attributed to a specific data subject without the use of additional information, provided that such additional information is kept separately and is subject to technical and organizational measures to ensure that the personal data are not attributed to an identified or identifiable natural person, right? So the data has been de-identified, the personal information has been removed and hopefully kept secure and encrypted. And so all the identifiable data has been removed or redacted, and this cannot be traced back to the real values. Re-identification of data can only be achieved with knowledge of the re-identification key or by combination to other, possibly by combination with other data sources. So that is also a possibility for pseudonymized data. And as I said, that key is kept secure by the data owner and also possibly, ideally encrypted, definitely encrypted. And I think, Maureen, we can move to the next slide. Thank you. Okay, so again, a second slide on this. So according to the ICO, re-identification describes the process of turning anonymized data back into personal data through the use of data matching or similar techniques, okay? And the DPA does not prohibit the disclosure of personal data, but any disclosure needs to be fair, lawful, and in compliance with data protection principles. So going back to what just Maureen mentioned earlier and that information loss that we mentioned, so we want to only pseudonymize or anonymize data to an extent that doesn't have that much information loss. Right, so what we need to consider when we anonymize or pseudonymize data, so we need to consider the age of the information. So of course data becomes less sensitive over time, but there we might need to consider ethical considerations. So for example, data that might not perhaps link to someone, perhaps that because that person might be deceased, they might however affect their relatives who might still be alive. So we need to keep that in mind. We also need to consider the level of detail, the context. So is the information, is the data based on the private life of that individual, or is it more about more public matters such as their working life or life satisfaction information? And then here we use normally a rule of thumb. We can think about that way. So we try to always assess the effect, if any, that the disclosure would have or on any individual concerned or a data subject. So when we think about whether we choose, we anonymize data completely, so data that is completely stripped of any identifiable information, or we think of pseudonymization, so data that will still have some indirect identifiers, as we call them, as we'll look at them. When we think about choosing between one or the other, we need to ask ourselves a few questions, and hopefully that will take us to a place where we can hopefully not strip the data of all all that valuable information that would allow it to be used at its full potential. Okay, and I think we can move to the next slide, Maureen. Thank you. And here I try to just put together a visualization of, so the first arrow at the top there, the blue, is just going from left to right. So we have raw identifiable data. So this is data that, we start a research project, we collect the data, has everything in it, including identifying information, personal information. And then we move to de-identified, which is just removing the personal information. Then we have pseudonymized, which is still de-identified, but on top of that, we might also remove other information that might help identify the information. So it's a bit more anonymized than de-identified, if that makes sense. And then we have anonymized data, which is data that has been completely stripped of that identifying information. So as you can see, it's not necessarily a clear point what is the difference between de-identified and pseudonymized, the difference between pseudonymized and anonymized. It's more of a spectrum, and it's very much context dependent and depending on every project. If we run SDC on different data sets, it might be that in one you can keep certain information and another you cannot. It depends on the sample size as well. There are multiple factors that determine really. And then of course we have data governance. So we need to think about, to consider the fact that there will be access controls in place perhaps that will allow the data to be kept de-identified or pseudonymized, and that is still fine. So that's what I try to represent here with the arrows. So that is the first arrow. The second arrow is the data utility. So this meaning, moving from right to left, as we, move from anonymized to towards pseudonymized and de-identified. That's where we have more utility in the data because we have more information about the data subject, etc. And then we have the third arrow, which is access controls. So of course, as we move from anonymized data, which is the least problematic, and it can be openly available perhaps online, then we move to more not problematic, but and data that needs more control, right? So it needs to be either safeguarded, or it needs to be under some sort of access regulation to account for that extra information that there is in the data about the data subjects. And then lastly, we have information loss. So this moves, of course, from left to right. So the more anonymized the data is, the more information loss we have. Yeah, that right. And now, because we talked about access control, so managing access to data, of course, as we discussed in the previous slide, so the more anonymized the data is, the less we have to worry about restricting access. And so every archive or repository will have their own version, but this is normally widespread. So there will be three more or less large categories. We have open data, which is available to anyone really without a registration. So this is data that would be anonymous, that is not considered to be risky in terms of identifying the data subjects. Then we have safeguarded. This will require registration and signing some sort of end user license. There might be also special agreements for more sensitive data, such as obtaining permission from the data owner, or there might be also an embargo fixed for a fixed period of time. And then we have controlled. So safeguarded will apply to pseudonymized data, perhaps even de-identified data. And so, as we spoke in the previous slide, is not really that, cutoff point. We say, oh, this is pseudonymized, this is de-identified, this is, it's quite, it will depend on each project, but safeguarded applies in that area there between pseudonymized, de-identified, and anonymous. And then we have control data. So this would apply to data that is de-identified, and this will probably be available for remote or safe room access. This will need to be, the people that have access to this kind of data will need to be vetted. They will have to probably have some training in advance, and they will only be able to access this from a remote or a safe room access. Of course, that's a bit different now with COVID, but there'll be a lot more restrictions in place, because this is data that is quite sensitive and potentially identifiable. Okay. Yeah, and here we just had a slide with some more information on data management, and in terms of best practice for data management. We have, there's a book, Managing and Sharing Research Data, which has now been, there's a new edition of this book that we released, I believe, was it last year, 2019, Maureen? I think you would know better, because Maureen is one of the authors there.
2020 is the publication year from, so last year we've introduced the second edition of it, and we have some new information in there, some new chapters in there and such like.
Yeah, so yeah, please have a look. I think it's available on Amazon as well. And then we included also a link to our training events, which we run, and then our Twitter information.
Can you tell this is the first time we're using Mentimeter, but we're getting there, don't worry.
Is the first time we're using, well, yeah, I have used Mentimeter in the past, but not on a webinar. It was much easier in person when you can just project it on the board. Yeah. Okay, so we have, I can see there's still people adding, but the number one, well, the most common answer is name. And yeah, you got it right. Name, address, date of birth. I see postcode there, phone number, passport number, IP address, national insurance number, home address. And yeah, I can see other words as well. However, those are not necessarily direct identifiers. So I can see gender, I can see occupation, I can see, let me see, I can, What else is there? Right, but I think the most common ones are correct. So yes, you got it right. So we have name, address, date of birth, email, locations, social security number, national insurance number, NHS number, yeah, postcode. So that's all good. Those are direct identifiers. So those are things that, or well, identifiers, not things, that would point to a specific individual. And would help, obviously, it would disclose who they are. Okay, so we're moving on to the next slide now. And the next slide, we have indirect identifiers. So it's the same concept here. Please, if you just type indirect identifiers, and we'll just give you few seconds to do that, and then we'll talk through them. And we should say that this applies both to qualitative and quantitative, of course. When we're not sort of making the distinction in the presentation and in the exercise, it's because we are talking about both qual and quant. Yeah. Okay, so I see quite a few people have submitted their answers so far, so we can start looking at them. So I see the most common answer is gender, and we have age, we have occupation, nationality, ethnicity, workplace, what else? Job, profession, sexual orientation, income. What else is there? Salary, town, medical condition, place of work, employer. Right, so this is very good. The most common ones are spot on. They are indirect identifiers. So they're things that are not direct identifiers, so they wouldn't point to an individual. However, if we think about combining all this information, then it could potentially lead to identification. If we know this much about someone, even if we don't know their name or their phone number, perhaps we can deduce who they are. Okay, so very good, everyone, on this exercise. So we have the answers now. Majority of people said no. Someone's job title is not a direct identifier. So here, it's yes and no. If it can be, if that is a very specific job title. So, for example, just to give someone in our organization used to have a very specific job title. If you put his title in Google, there was only one person with that specific job title, and I remember he would mention this all the time to me. Yes, so in that case, it would be a direct identifier, right? Or if someone has a very public position, then of course, then that would be personal information because it would link to that person in particular. So it depends. Of course, if it's a research officer, then of course that is not pointing to a specific person, so it wouldn't be a direct identifier. Okay, so all right, let's move to the next question. What are direct identifiers? Tick all that apply. So we have job title, we have email address, we have health diagnostics, we have age, party affiliation, and national insurance number. It does not let us choose more than one, and this is very annoying because I did tick a multiple choice option. So yes, I guess it's not tick all that apply, but we will discuss, of course, that there are multiple direct identifiers here. So most people chose email address, and that is correct. And then the second most popular answer was national insurance number. That's also correct. And then a job title. Yes, based on the previous slide, it can be a direct identifier as well. And then we have the incorrect answers, which is health diagnostics, age, and party affiliation. Those are with referred to as indirect identifiers, right? So they don't necessarily point to one person. Okay, next question. Okay, what are indirect identifiers? So not personal. It's again take all that apply, but you'll probably only be able to select one, which is a shame, but okay, so we have the answers in. The most popular answer was gender. We have date of birth as well. We have sexual preference and ethnic background. Those are all what we refer to as indirect identifiers. And then we have geographic coordinates and supermarket preference. So those are not necessarily indirect identifiers. It doesn't really, help narrow down someone if we know that they prefer to shop in, I don't know, Asda as opposed to Tesco. So it's not really something there. And then we have geographic coordinates, which of course is it's a direct identifier if that geographic coordinate is of someone's house or so. Yeah. Okay, moving on to the next question. Okay, is this true or false? Anonymizing direct identifiers, so for example, name or contact details, is that enough to consider the data anonymized? Okay, right, so most people said false, and that's correct. So just just removing direct identifiers is not enough to say that the data is anonymized, because there's still that, the indirect identifiers left. So all that information about, age, gender, occupation, etc., that can help us piece together who that person is. Okay, very good. Next question. Is this true or false? Data collected on a sensitive topic is always sensitive data. So think about sensitive topics, sensitive data. Is that the same?
Yeah, so sensitive topics can be sensitive data. It's possible that they overlap, but it's not necessarily always the case that a sensitive topic or something that we would deem sensitive is necessarily always going to be sensitive data. So sensitive data, we'll talk about a little bit later, is very strictly defined within law to be referring to very specific social characteristics. And often what we deem to be a sensitive topic to research can expand beyond what that legal definition is. There's obviously a very human evaluation put on research there. So they can be the same thing, but not necessarily always the same thing.
Right, so true or false? Is it good practice to annotate anonymization in qualitative research? For example, with square brackets or anonymization log?
And I should say those square brackets, meaning like if you're reading an interview transcript, because we're talking about qualitative research, if you're reading an interview transcript or something like that, square brackets would indicate something. Is that the good practice that you should do?
Yeah, Maureen?
Okay.
Yeah,
that tends to be what we recommend, and I'll talk a little bit more later about what that is. It's usually a good idea to keep track of anonymization changes somewhere. It may be by annotating transcript, or it may be keeping a separate anonymization log. It's possible there might be some disciplines out there, though, that actually that's a little bit problematic. I know, for example, if you're working in history, it becomes very difficult actually to trace back and connect up dots if you've changed all the names and that sort of thing. So it's good to either have access to what was changed, or, so different disciplines might have different rules about how they approach that. But generally speaking, we think it's generally good practice.
So which of the following strategies can be used to help protect participants' identities? Is it gaining informed consent, controlling access to data, or anonymizing data as soon as possible? And this should be a multiple choice again, but just in case it is, yes, no, you can't take more than one again.
We'll talk a little bit later about a three-prong approach to protecting participants and their identities, really making use of all of these things: consent, controlling access, and where needed, anonymization as well.
So what would be the first thing you do to anonymize data? Would you assess data presentation? Who is going to see it? Identify what my role is, what your role is. Consider access control, identifying direct identifiers and beginning changing them, or mapping the data, so identifying what is personal data, sensitive data, etc. Okay, so the most common answer was mapping the data, identifying what is personal data, sensitive data, etc. That was the most common answer. It's very good. It's one of the correct answers. And then also assessing data presentation. So we need to think about who is going to see it. If we're not planning on sharing the data, then there's of course a different scenario. And then identifying what your role is, especially when you work in a research team, that might be that might be a very important step as well.
So Anka, you want to carry on?
Yeah. So based on what we already looked at in the Mentimeter question, so just making it clear here what are the different types of identifiers. So we have identifying variables and we have sensitive variables, right? And under identifying variables we have direct identifiers and key identifiers, or indirect identifiers. So direct identifiers is information that directly identifies data subjects. So example here, as we saw in Mentimeter, so social insurance number, names, addresses, etc. Then we have key identifiers. So this is information that in combination, all pieced together, may uniquely identify data subjects and can potentially be linked to other sources of data as well. So such as the electoral register, for example. And examples here, we have gender, age, region, occupation, income. And if we think back of the word cloud in Mentimeter, those are very good examples as well that you have come up with. And then we have sensitive variables. So this is information that is often subject to legal and ethical concerns. So examples here are criminal history, sexual preference and behavior, political affiliations, medical records, income, and this can lead to attribute disclosure even if identity disclosure is prevented. So even if that primary disclosure is not possible because we don't necessarily have identifying information. Attribute disclosure, so secondary, it's also possible because we are, it's possible to sort of narrow down who that person is. And just an observation here that one variable can be both identifying and sensitive. So for example, income, and really that this applies to multiple examples here. And I linked a very interesting article there at the bottom, You're Not So Anonymous. Please go and have a read. It's very interesting.
You want me to open it, Anka? Shall I open it?
We can. I'm just wary of the time
okay.
that we have. We're a bit, yeah. But if you have the time to go and read that, it's about someone from a computer scientist from Harvard who has a very cool job, and she tries to she really does these exercises of you know, picking data sets that are available, and then trying to see if she can find out who the data subjects are. And she was able to do this multiple times, and this article sort of goes over that, and it's very interesting just to see how, even if there are things that not necessarily you wouldn't think, oh yeah, this is not disclosive, potentially it can be when you link it to other information that maybe is available about you out there. Yeah, so then we have, so in terms of thinking about how we start an anonymization process or a pseudonymization process, so the first step here, as we saw in Mentimeter, so it can vary, but this is similar to both quant and qual, and the first step is usually to identify and remove or redact identifying information. So those direct identifiers are the first thing that we should really think about. This is normally, well, some people say it's easier for quantitative data because, you remove a variable or two or three or four, and it can be more difficult for qualitative data, where perhaps we wouldn't delete it, you wouldn't redact it out, but you would replace it with pseudonyms, or you wouldn't redact it out, as Maureen pointed out earlier, that we have that information loss, and the more information we have, the better, which also applies to quantitative, but I feel like it's particularly the case for some qualitative studies. Yeah.
Yeah, the nature of
Sorry.
qualitative data is such that, that additional context is often really important. So even when they're direct identifiers, sometimes that can be quite important to what they're talking about. So we used the example earlier of occupation and how actually you may be able to identify somebody from their occupation depending on the what the occupation is and how specific it is. And that occupation might be a key component of their identity, which helps to explain further information about that interview that was done or about that piece of writing that they've done. So sometimes it can vary with qualitative data where you're either trying to replace it with something that's similar but perhaps less disclosive, or you may choose to actually not take that out at all for various reasons. So even identifying direct identifiers with qualitative can be a little bit tricky sometimes.
Thank you, Maureen. I think we can move on to the next slide. Okay, so the step 2 would be to identify all indirect identifiers. And here, we're referring to all them, those details that piece together can potentially help identify someone. And these are a few examples, which I think we already mentioned both in Mentimeter and in the slide above. But I wanted to note here how important it is to have good quality metadata for this process. So especially at the point of, if you submit your data to an archive, in order for them to do a proper statistical disclosure review, they would need, this information. So they would need to know, what the variable label is, what the value labels are, the questionnaire, etc. So yeah, that would be this slide. And then, okay, so the step 3, then we will look at the data more in detail. So it's after we narrowed down and we identified what the key variables are, what the indirect identifiers are. Then we would need to look at frequencies in the data to identify potentially disclosive information. And then we look at the outliers as well. As part of that, we need to look at string variables as well. So when we have those open text, if we have a multiple choice question and then we have an open text for other, we need to make sure that we pay specific attention to that, because people might, mention different things in there that perhaps are problematic. They can be personal information, but it can also be quite sensitive information. So, if they say they worked for a particular company for 30 years, that might help, narrow down who that person is, especially in combination with other information. Or I included a couple more examples there. And I also linked here an introduction to statistical disclosure review, or and then you can have a read. This is quite a large document, but it covers everything in more detail on how to do SDC for data anonymization. Sorry, Maureen, is this the next slide, or is this
Yeah, this is the next slide.
Okay, so then we have some tips. So what we do to go about anonymizing or pseudonymizing. So of course, we have aggregation, so reducing the precision depending where, and this applies. I think some of this also applies to qualitative data. So if we have, for example, for location, we might aggregate from a village to a city or to a county. So the the more we aggregate, the less less precision we have, of course, and the less disclosive it can be. We can recode categorical key variables into fewer categories. We can suppress specific values of key variables for some units, so especially low counts, and this is what we were referred to in SDC as k-anonymity. And again, you can read more about this, but it is really, we don't have the time to go into more detail about this, but it's basically if we have very low counts for a specific variable or specific number of variables, which in combination can really point to someone or to a couple of people in particular. It's normally we have a threshold that shouldn't be, if we say, okay, a specific count should not be lower than 5 or lower than 10. If we only have 2 observations, for example, or 1 observation for a couple of variables, then of course that can be quite disclosive and we might need to suppress that. Generalizing the meaning of text variables, so replacing potentially disclosive free text, as we mentioned in the slide before. So this would be recoding that other option into one of the multiple answer questions. Restricting upper or lower ranges of continuous variables to hide outliers. So here, for example, for age, we would recode, we would either band it, so have age groups, or we would just recode it into over 70s. This would, so how to decide this, we would look at the distribution of that variable. So, you know, if we only have, I don't know, 2 people over 70s, then we might do that. Or if we have outliers there, so we need to decide where the outliers are, if there are any, and then we would restrict that upper range or lower range as well. This is the same for income, right? So we would want to ban that or to restrict the upper range of that of the income variable as well. And then, of course, we probably need to anonymize georeference data as well, so replacing point coordinates with non-disclosive variables. So if we have latitude and longitude there, of course, if it's someone's house, if it's someone's place of work, then we would need to either replace that with I don't know, just a more aggregate information. Or, of course, if that is something that is very, very relevant, and this applies really to all the above points as well, if it's something that is very key to that project and to reusing that data or to using that data, then access control is always preferred to removing very, very valuable data to that project. So it's very, very much context and specific, right, to every research project. Okay. Right, and here I listed a couple of useful software that that we use at the UK Data Service, or that you might be interested in looking or having a look at, or you're probably already aware of them. So the first one is SDC Micro, which is an R package. This is free, and it has a very useful sort of user-friendly interface. So if you don't necessarily have coding skills and you don't necessarily want to write a script, then that is very easy to use. And then I included the manual there if you click on the SDC Micro. And then we have QMI Data, which is something that it's a free, easy to use open source tool that we developed at UKDS. It's available on GitHub along with a manual and some exercises if you want to have a look at it. And this uses automated methods to detect and report on some of the most common problems in survey and numeric data, such as missingness, duplication, outliers, and direct identifiers. And then we have a couple more examples. So we have ARX and UArgus, and I included the links for you there as well if you want to have a look. And I think the last one is for Maureen to explain a little bit for
Yeah,
you?
so we do have a text anonymization helper tool, and this uses MS Word macros, and it basically just looks through chunks of text that you have and identifies capital letters and numbers, which are often the things that indicate something could be disclosive. So anonymizing qualitative data is obviously a little bit trickier in the sense that, you know, there's so much context and anecdotes shared there that any of those could indirectly identify somebody because they are unique to an individual's experience. But the text anonymization helper tool just helps to identify, well, what are some of the proper nouns that are being used, which could be identifying, you know, specific places or specific names, and what are some of the numbers that are being used. So it just searches the document and helps highlight those so you don't miss any out, basically. And when you're anonymizing qualitative data, we do have just a few tips to try and help. We kind of got through step one and then stopped with qualitative data because, of course, that context is also often very important to the analysis. And it's sometimes difficult to anonymize further than that without losing the value. But what we would say is when you are planning on doing some sort of anonymization at any level within qual data, try to do so at the time of transcription, with the exception of longitudinal studies. So longitudinal studies, it's often important to make those links between, say, different interviews or different pieces of writing or whatever you're working with. You know, keeping that ID with the person. So if you are needing to make linkages, you may need to do anonymization later. But if you're not making those linkages, we would definitely say try and do it at the time of transcription because that's when it's easiest. It's when you're going through word for word what your data is, and you'll pick up more that way. Try and keep a consistency throughout the research team and throughout the project. So we tend to write up transcription guidelines, and we have some examples on our website of transcription guidelines just to help keep that consistency. Where you are doing some sort of replacement or redaction, it's always good to identify that. We often annotate that with brackets, but obviously depending on what kind of transcription guideline you're following, there's different ways of annotating that, generally speaking. But it's often important to know where something has been changed and if it has been changed. And using some sort of annotation like square brackets just helps indicate that. If you are doing some sort of replacement or redaction or aggregation, you may also consider keeping an anonymization log. This is quite time intensive to do this, but it does mean that you would be able to go back and double check what the original raw data said if you needed it at any point. So keeping a log of those replacements might be useful later on. We would say avoid blanking out, avoid complete redaction, and instead use pseudonyms or replacements. This for qualitative data, that context is really important. And when you redact out, you can really see a stark difference between an interview transcript that's loaded with just a bunch of X's because they've redacted out versus a transcript where you can actually follow some of the interpersonal relationships because they've gone through the hassle of kind of using pseudonyms instead. So you can more closely identify how people appear and go in and out of different stories that your participants tell you about. And generally speaking, we try to avoid over-anonymizing. So when we are in charge of anonymization, digitization, transcription, we try and do as little as possible just because it can make the data more misleading or unreliable, perhaps even unusable. So we try to err on the side of caution with this. And actually, we use other strategies as well to protect participants' identities. So specifically, thinking about making sure that there is consent in place, that your participants know that you're sharing data or that you're going to use data extracts in a particular way, and just making sure that you have the consent in place is one way. but also controlling the access to the data as well. So if you are archiving the data with us, for example, you can choose either safeguarded or controlled as opposed to more open data. And that's just another way of saying, well, I can't completely, take everything out that would be identifying. So instead, I'll control who can actually get a hold of this data itself. So there are other strategies, and you should really think of it as more of a three-prong approach to protecting your participants' identities rather than just simply relying on redaction in order to protect their identities. So if you are anonymizing transcripts, this is sort of, an example of what we could potentially do. So you'd replace the name with a different fake name. You might take out and aggregate specific dates to something that's a bit larger. So rather than 2nd of May, 1965, you just do 1965, or perhaps even May 1965. If there's a location that's mentioned, you may think about aggregating it to a larger location, or perhaps deleting it. And where you have replaced a name then, so where Lucas Roberts was replaced with Ken, it then meant that everywhere Lucas was mentioned, you'd have to replace Ken. And when you're using consent then, to ensure that your participants are fully informed, we do have some examples on our website of how we've talked about that within projects that we've processed, or how some who have deposited with us, what they've done to approach that. So just making sure that extracts of interviews and some photographs may be used on this website. We'll get permission from you before using a quotation or a photograph of you, or, in mine, I've asked for permission to use anonymized quotations and narrative themes. And I've talked through with my participants what that means. I won't use your name per se, but it may be that I'm describing an instance that could potentially be identified from somebody who knows you personally, or something like that. And in my experience, participants are fairly easygoing about that. They're kind of aware of what that means, but it's just making sure that you've had those discussions with participants about where you'll use it. We've sometimes seen consent forms come in that say, your data will never be shared with anybody outside the research team. And it kind of restricts you, because does that mean you can't use any data quotations in publications? Does it mean that if somebody new joined the team after you've taken that data already, that they're not able to see that? Does that mean that your institution or your ethics committee is unable to do any kind of audit of your projects? So it's just thinking through all of the various ways that you might share bits of data. And it is also possible for us to kind of cater to your specific data set, particularly with qualitative, where some interviews might be more sensitive than other interviews. So for example, we have a collection called The Health and Social Consequences of the Foot and Mouth Disease Epidemic in North Cumbria, 2001 to 2003. Now, the foot and mouth disease epidemic was quite a unique instance in the history of farming in North Cumbria. And there were 54 people who participated in this project. And what we ended up doing was making 40 of the interviews and diary transcripts available for reuse under safeguarded access, but we did actually embargo some of them as well until fairly recently. And then there's also audio files that are available, but they're only available by permission from researchers. So you can kind of think about, well, maybe some data is okay to share, and other data, I just need to restrict the access a little bit more on that one, and you can kind of cater your strategy to that specific data set. We do have a couple examples of issues in anonymization that I just wanted to share as well. So for example, we've got the Pioneers of Social Research. And this project was an oral history project, which was looking at the life stories of pioneering social researchers and it covered everything from their family background, their childhoods and growing up, what their education background is, and what their key contributions to their field were. So these were quite prominent academics, quite well known, and actually it became a bit silly thinking, well, we'll anonymize this, because there's just no way when it's somebody who is of that kind of prominence, there's just no way of being able to, anonymize that. So what we did instead was kind of just make sure that the consent was in place from participants, that they knew that their actual names and all of those details would be shared. And they had a little bit more control where if they didn't want to share certain details, then they didn't have to. Of course, despite the fact that all participants said, yeah, it's fine, go ahead and share all this information, at the same time, we were hit with a few conundrums where some talked about, for example, legal cases that we may not have been able to share that kind of information legally. There would have been some sort of privilege there of not being able to share. And there were also instances where people talked about medical conditions of people who weren't taking part in the project. They were just, people within their social circle. So we did have to make ethical decisions about redacting some of that information because it did pose a certain sensitivity there where we still needed to do some editing. But we tried to make it really light touch and ensure it only was done on issues where there was a clear concern for those who were being discussed. We also have a very different collection called Managing Suffering at the End of Life. And this collection looked at people's experiences of dying. So there comes a point in palliative care where sedation to induce a coma may be the only option to give patients the kind of comfort they need as they near the end of their life. So this kind of, continuous deep sedation until death was explored by Jane Seymour. And, basically what she did was gained consent from participants after they had participated in the research. So they did the interviews, and then she came back to them after some time had passed and they'd been able to process what happened. And she then talked to them about the possibility of sharing the data and depositing it at the UK Data Service. And most of her participants did agree to this, but giving them that little bit of time between the data collection and the consent for sharing was actually really important. And in that, they were able to also negotiate what kind of details that they wanted to share or that they didn't want to share. And often one of the biggest issues that we have with qualitative collections is that people feel that their data is extremely sensitive and it's not possible to share data onward, or it's not possible to effectively anonymize the data in a way that it can be shared more widely. And it's just to point out that sensitivity, it does mean something quite specific within law. So sensitive personal data does refer to specifically talking about people's racial or ethnic origin, their political opinions, religious beliefs, if they're involved in trade unions, mental health or physical health, sexual life and sexual identities, so on and so forth. And there's some legal bits there as well about offenses and legal trials. So specifically when we talk about sensitive data, that's what we mean. But often sometimes people feel like the topic itself is sensitive, and it may not necessarily fall into one of these. So for example, if somebody is researching migration or refugee status, it may not necessarily fall into one of these, but at the same time, it's still a sensitive topic. Or in this case, managing suffering at the end of life. Obviously, it can be an extremely sensitive topic. And some of this may have touched on, physical or mental health, but, there are still ways of managing how you are protecting participant identities through the use of consent and through the use of access. So it's just to sort of drive home that point that actually we do have more than one way to ensure confidentiality. And just as a final kind of wrapping up of qualitative data, I just wanted to share as well, we do kind of come up with these anonymization plans when we are processing collections at the UK Data Service. And these anonymization plans sort of start with a project background. We talk a little bit about how we're going to manage those data files, and then we specify what's going to be mandatory anonymization versus what might be possible anonymization. So I've listed just some examples here. So often when we do mandatory anonymization, we're thinking about what are the direct identifiers, what sorts of things were talked about within this collection that might be a direct identifier. In a collection like the Pioneers, our anonymization plan for that just said there's no mandatory anonymization. We have consent in place to share this data. So that was all that was written. So it's just thinking about what kind of data was collected and what might be identifiable or disclosive. So what might be mandatory. But then thinking beyond that, there might also be some possible anonymization. And that's where you might have, for example, medical information or sensitive information, where actually you need to think about where there might be harm caused to others if that kind of information came out. And the same sort of goes for even if you're just providing extracts in publications or talking about it at a conference, you should hopefully ideally be thinking about, well, is it ethical to share this kind of information, or should that be redacted or pseudonymized, so on and so forth. Okay, so I think I think at this point, what time are we at, Anka?
We probably don't have time for the exercises, but we do have some questions that I've also been trying to answer while you were presenting now in Q&A.
The exercises that we do have are available online, and they do have the answers with them online as well. So if you do want to have a look and have a go at de-identifying quantitative or qualitative data, there are a couple exercises available on our website, and they do come with the answers. We also have loads of tools and templates like transcription instructions, confidentiality agreements that might be useful when you're thinking about your own projects. And we also have some further resources listed on our website, and some of them are linked in this PowerPoint as well, which you'll have access to through our website afterward. But some of these are like the ADF that I talked about with Mark Elliott, and others are sort of like the ICO's code of practice for anonymization. And we do have some upcoming events as well. So if you did want more information about data management or about ethical and legal obligations, we do specifically have some more webinars on that coming up. So do check out our events page. So what we'll do now is anything you didn't get to, Anka, we can kind of go through the Q&A. Do you want to, if you can read them out, because I can't bring up the Q&A while I'm sharing my screen.
That's fine. I'll just ask, so we had a question about why does anonymous data need to be safeguarded, and why doesn't that mean that the data can be open? So this goes back to our conversation in the earlier slides when we said that, no data really, it's very difficult, some data, to classify something as anonymous. So sometimes we would look at a data set and say, yeah, okay, you probably cannot, like the risk is very, very minimal, close to zero, but it's still not zero. So in that case, it might be that we decide to make that data safeguarded instead of open, even though, going back to that graph that we looked at, where it's not necessarily a cutoff point where we say, yes, this is completely anonymized, it's not completely anonymized. So it's really just looking at the data and the context and knowing whether there's some other information out there that can be linked to that data, etc. So yeah, that's why we said that. Another question was, right, let's look at something that about should qualitative researchers give research participants the copies of consent forms? Maureen, would you like to take this one?
Yeah, it's probably a good practice to make sure that your participants have their own copy of the information sheets. Do they need a copy of a signed consent form? I do know some researchers are able to do photocopies or images while they're in situ and just give that to the participant right away, or they bring with them a spare copy. I would say that just to cover your own back legally, you should try and make sure that you keep the a copy, if not the copy, of the signed consent form. So it just makes sure I mean, I've never heard of any issues coming up as a consequence, but if there was any sort of issue around it and it ended up going to a court, courts like signed written consent. And if it's not signed written consent, then hopefully you've recorded the consent. Because if you can't prove consent, then in the eyes of the law, then there is no consent. So yeah, I would say it's a good idea to make sure your participant has their own copy of those things. But you should definitely make sure that you are keeping the signed copy if there is only one copy, just to cover yourself.
Great, thank you, Maureen. There's another question about, someone asked, would you recommend keeping original interview transcripts before anonymization as well as having an anonymization log?
That depends on where you plan on storing those unanonymized. So there obviously is a much greater disclosure risk with unanonymized transcripts. So if you're just saving it on your computer and there's a simple password protection where your password is password1, that's probably not the greatest idea. However, if you have access to a secure server, and there are safeguards in place for that unanonymized data, then it is possible to keep that copy. We say anonymize at the point of transcription because if there was a potential risk, such as your laptop is stolen and that's got your data on it, you've helped already minimize it by not having unanonymized transcripts available on there, if that makes sense. So if you have the proper infrastructure for it, yes, absolutely, you can keep a unanonymized transcript. But if you don't feel comfortable with the storage that you have, that it's appropriate enough or that it's secure enough, then you probably should just make sure that the only copies you have are anonymized.
Thank you, Maureen. We're already 2 minutes over. We did have more questions, but unfortunately we ran out of time. If you had a question for us, please email us. Use the contact information that we provided in the presentation, and we will be happy to answer all the questions.